In this video, we're going to be looking at some sample questions and answers for part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. The topic that I've chosen today for these questions is a topic that someone actually requested, and that is the topic of computers. Not the most common topic that could come up in part 1, but you've got to remember the examiner is always trying to surprise you a little bit with the topics. They don't want you to just memorize answers that you can fit with the questions that they give you. Of course, they want to test your real speaking ability. So they're trying to surprise you a little bit with these questions. And maybe these questions today might surprise you a little. But you've got to be ready for this. And the way you answer any of these questions in part 1, well, it should be pretty similar no matter what the topic is. You've got to give a nice clear answer that directly answers that question, making sure that the answer is not too short, but also not too long. You don't want to go off topic and tell the examiner something they didn't really ask for. You've got to keep that answer nice and focused and quite concise. But again, remembering that it's not too short. I often tell people that they should be using answers that are around 2 sentences. Now, this isn't a rule. You don't have to always stick with 2 sentences, but it's a good guideline to follow here to give these nice, clear answers. So 1 sentence that's directly answering the question, and then 1 that kind of explains a bit further, just so we fully answer those questions. So what we'll do is we'll look at the 4 questions I've chosen on the topic of computers first, and think about what those questions are asking us to do. And then I'll show you the answers, and we can look at those answers together, and I'll give a quick analysis of why these are good answers for part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. So let's have a look at the questions first. Here you can see the first one is, how often do you use a computer? Quite a simple, short question there. See, it starts with how often. This is quite a common style of question in part 1 of the test. Remember, the questions are always going to be about you, and this is how often you do something. Here it's, well, using a computer. So of course, when you answer this, you're going to have to say how often you use a computer. Is it every day? Is it once a week? Is it very often or not so often? So you've got to clearly answer that, and then maybe explain a bit why after that, so you give a nice full answer. Notice as well, of course, this answer is focused on the present tenses. So you've got to show that you understand the tense of the question too. Now, the second question here is, what do you usually use your computer for? Again, really not the most complex question, quite a short question, pretty easy to understand. But again, it's focused on the present, something that you usually do. Well, what do you usually use your computer for? What are the reasons for using a computer? And then you can just, maybe in the first sentence, give the main reason that you use your computer, and then explain a bit more why after you give that direct answer. But we don't need to go into too much detail here, remembering that these are part 1 questions. They don't need a massive amount of detail. There's other parts in the test where you're required to give more detail. So the third question is here. When was the first time you used a computer? So you can see this question is slightly different. Well, yes, it's on the topic of computers, but here it's a question about the past. When was? You can see that key word there that shows it's about the past. When was the first time you used a computer? So of course, you've got to think back to the first time as quickly as possible. Think about this. The answer doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be true, really. You've just got to give a nice quick answer about that first time. So your answer is going to be focused on that time in the past, and then explain a little bit after that. But you can see here how the examiner's switching a little bit from asking you questions that focused on the present to then asking you questions that are about the past. And this is something the examiner is going to do to check that you can deal with using verbs in different forms, which a lot of people can struggle with. And this is the same as the fourth question. You see here again, it's about the past. How did you learn to use a computer? So again, it's asking you about the past. How did you learn to use a computer? So of course, you've got to kind of give a direct answer explaining how you learnt. And then maybe a second sentence just explaining in a bit more detail. And that's what we're going to be doing in the answers, is using this kind of technique of giving nice clear answers that are straight to the point, and also just extending the answer a little with an extra sentence explaining and giving a bit more detail. So what I'll do now is just go through the answers to those 4 questions, and you can just listen, think about what's making that answer a good high-level answer that really the kind of student that would be giving these types of answers would be getting very high band scores in the speaking test. So let's have a look at these 4 answers to the 4 questions. So the first question, how often do you use a computer? I use my PC just about every day. I'll often spend most of the day sitting in front of it. In fact, I should probably cut down on my screen time. What do you usually use your computer for? I mostly use it for work, but I also spend time watching films on it. It's a necessity for my job, and it's nice if I want to enjoy a film on my own. When was the first time you used a computer? It must have been at home when I was very young. I remember there was a game I liked playing on my mum's Amstrad computer that she used for work. How did you learn to use a computer? I think my mum probably taught me the basics, and then I learned a bit more when I was at school. Since then, I've taught myself through trial and error or searching the internet. There we go. Those are the answers to the 4 questions. Nothing too complex there. Hopefully there wasn't much there that you couldn't understand. There might have been a few words or phrases that you're a bit unfamiliar with, and of course I'll go through those answers and explain any things that I feel like might be a bit difficult to understand, but really the answers are pretty simple. But they're very clear too, and easy to understand. Really, this is what you need to do in part 1, is keep your answers quite simple. There's nothing too complicated in the answers here, really. But you can also hopefully see that they're error-free. There's no mistakes in these answers at all. And again, this is something that takes time to practice, to get to that level where you're able to make these nice full sentences with no mistakes. But again, these are good examples that you can kind of take from and try to use the same techniques that we're using to answer these questions when you're answering your questions that you get in your test. So let's have a look at these answers in a bit more detail and think about what's good about them. So the answer to that first question, which was the how often question, how often do you use a computer? You can see in that first sentence, we've just directly answered that question. We're copying words from the question. We've used the word use. It's how often do you use a computer? So we've used that verb, use. But then you can see we've changed one of the words slightly. We haven't said a computer, we've said my PC. Now, of course, you don't have to do this, changing words from the question in the answer, but it's something a high-level student will naturally do. We're kind of paraphrasing here. And then we're giving a direct answer. It says how often, so of course, we've said how often. Just about every day. So there we go. Nice, clear answer there, straight to the point. A pretty short sentence, but you can see in the second sentence, we've given a slightly longer sentence and explained a bit more. You see here in that second sentence as well, we've changed things up a little bit. We've said, I'll often spend most of the day sitting in front of it. Well, it, of course, is the computer, the PC. So that's how we're linking these two sentences with the word it. Also, you notice at the beginning, the way we're using the verb has changed slightly. Now, it looks like we're using the future simple here. I'll often spend most of the day. So here, this might seem a little strange, but very often we do use this tense to talk about something we often do. So I'll often. This is quite a common usage of grammar here that you might want to practice using yourselves. And then I extend the sentence a bit more by saying, in fact, well, I should probably cut down on my screen time. A nice use of a phrasal verb here, cut down on. So we've got the verb cut and we've got down on, two prepositions there. But the meaning of this is to, well, reduce or decrease my screen time. Something that the examiner is kind of listening for to see if you can use this kind of idiomatic vocabulary that native speakers would use in day-to-day conversation. There's nothing really that kind of academic about the way we're speaking here. Yes, it's the IELTS academic speaking test, but they're not expecting you to speak like a professor. They want you to kind of be using English the same way your average native speaker would be using English to communicate. So that's the first answer. Let's move on to the second one, to that second question, which, if you remember, was what do you usually use your computer for? So, of course, we've given that direct answer first, just like we did before. I mostly use it for work. Well, we've kind of changed it a bit here again. Instead of saying usually, we've said mostly, which is something you can do. You don't have to. And then we've said what we use it for. Well, for work. Then we've extended that first sentence bit to give some extra information about other things we use it for. But I also spend some time watching films on it. So, spend some time watching films. Watching films is the other activity that we do, other than work. Nothing that incredible there, really. I mean, there's the combination of the verb spend and time, which could be new for some of us. And then we've got a second sentence there, just to explain a bit more about both of those reasons, work and watching films. It's a necessity for my job. Well, we don't repeat the word work there, we use the word job instead. Also, the word necessity might be unfamiliar to some of us. Necessity just means that we need to do it. Necessity is a noun, of course. The adjective would be it's necessary, but we've used it's a necessity here. Nice word to maybe make a note of and remember. And then we've also extended it because we're talking a bit about watching films as well. And it's nice if I want to enjoy a film on my own. So again, trying to change things up a bit, not repeating things too much. We didn't say watching films there, but we said enjoy a film. It's all about showing a bit of variety here, but making it sound as natural as possible. These are things that should come to us automatically with a bit of practice. Now, the third answer to the third question. The question was, when was the first time you used a computer? So, of course, here we're talking about the past. And you can see the question is using the past simple. But we've started the answer a little bit differently here. Of course, we can use the present perfect to talk about past experience. So here you can see the beginning. We've said, it must have been at home. So this was when I was very young. So we've mixed up the present perfect and the past simple here. It must have been, you see there. Also, we've made a nice contraction with must and have. We've combined that to make must have. It must have been at home when I was very young. So we've given the time because the question was asking for the time. We've been nice and direct there. And then in the second sentence, we've given a bit more detail. I remember. This is often when they're asking you about things in the past. You can use this to introduce your sentence. I remember there was, of course, the past tense, a game that I liked playing on my mum's Amstrad computer that she used for work. So there we go. Just a bit more detail on when I was using the computer for the first time, what I was doing. An extra sentence there to extend my answer, but we're not really going off topic at all there. We're just extending that answer. Then we can move to the fourth and final question and answer. The question was, how did you learn to use a computer? Now, of course, again, you can see the first sentence is a nice, clear, direct answer. How did you learn? Well, I think my mum probably taught me the basics. So there, of course, we're talking about the past. So we've said my mum probably taught me, the past tense of teach, and then taught me the basics. Well, a nice phrase there, the basics. Using basics there as a noun, not an adjective. And this just means, well, the fundamentals, right? The simple things about using a computer, the basics. It's quite a common phrase there in English. And then we've extended that sentence, and then I learnt a bit more when I was at school. So again, focused on the past and when I was learning to use the computer. And how I learned? Well, I learned at school. Then we've got a second sentence. You don't necessarily need a second sentence there, but we've have extended it a little bit to show a bit more variety in terms of tense. Since then, well, then is connecting the sentence. Then we're referring to the time we're talking about in the previous sentence. And then I've said, I've just taught myself. So of course, there again, the use of the present perfect to talk about the past experience. I've just taught myself through trial and error or searching on the internet. Pretty simple there. We've said how we've learned. Well, I've taught myself. We've got a nice phrase there, trial and error. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but basically it just means through trying things and then making mistakes and learning from that. It's a really good way to learn, from making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. So there we go. Those are the answers to those 4 questions. Hopefully that's helpful for you to see the style of answers that we're giving in part 1. And really, hopefully, it makes it seem not too difficult or daunting to you to kind of think about making these kind of answers yourself. But with a bit of practice, I'm sure you will be able to give nice, clear answers like this that are not too short, but also not too long. And hopefully, eventually, error-free, without mistakes. So, yes, like I said, I hope that was helpful for you. And if it was, do remember to click the like button if you haven't already. And also remember to subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss out on similar videos in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you again in the next video.